Covenant of Dread, a short story. Through the blue smeg of a stale August afternoon, two aerial surveyors in short-sleeved shirts, flying a gimpy white Cessna up from Adelaide, reported the abandoned vehicle on a rocky path noted on specialist maps only as Track 19. The track crossed the flat stations at the back of Morronglea, a small scar on the face of red ochre, where a long, featureless horizon does shimmering tricks with the hot air. Balls of dried weed roll across the rocks. Essentially, it is a track to nowhere, giving access to the dire centre of truly miserable cattle runs, and on average, a vehicle might traverse its dusty hold every rare year between remote, reviving rains. There was no one attending the vehicle, as far as the surveyors could see. They flew closer on a second run and confirmed there was no one around. They felt an obligation to report it to the authorities in the days after returning. It seemed stranded there in the huge metaphysical nothing. The war was long over. It was 1963. It was time to account for all the missing. Accordingly, 2 weeks later, an officer, Sergeant Myers, a man with only partial curiosity, spent the whole tedious afternoon travelling to the recorded spot. And once there, he found the car, an old modelled grey four-door Essex sedan, completely out of petrol, with the keys still in the ignition. There was every appearance that it had been driven until it stopped. It was crisp in the sun, but its leather features were not intact. It had been there, it seemed, for years, maybe more, decades. Myers looked around the immediate vicinity, but seeing nothing but ochre emptiness, he made a report and drove back into the road stop 230 miles to the west. He was having a beer and cutlets when a report returned on his radio identifying the Essex as a lost cause from the 1930s. The lost cause in question was a young man named Arthur Norris, known as Vast Arthur. It was a notorious mystery in the annals of Coronga, south of Morronglea, once for a short time the gold mining mecca of the broadening plains. Myers was unfamiliar with the case, but returning to the station he referenced it in the system. The microfiche reader was new, the latest technology. He had access to a store of files on microfilm. The case was documented with newspaper reports, a coroner's briefing, letters and hand-scrawled notations from a Detective Nolan. The detective, who must have travelled up from Melbourne, was in fact copious in his renditions and obviously took an interest until the case was officially closed and Arthur was declared a lost cause. It was a case of missing person. Arthur had gone astray. For a detective to be involved, though, someone must have suspected a grisly hand or had other question marks. This Arthur was called Vast, it emerged, because he was a young man of renowned IQ. He was 19 at the time. When he had been just 14, so it said in the reports, he was the centre of a minor academic scandal. He successfully forged a series of poems by Swinburne and fooled his English teacher with them. He was supposedly in trouble, but everyone was nonetheless nonplussed by the poems. Later in a similar escapade, he passed off a scientific paper demonstrating that water has memory to a science teacher. His grades were average, and yet his teachers all complained his mind was vast, his capacity prodigious. Other reports related he was a cheerful kid, much liked among his peers, without any police attention, and he did well in track and field. He disappeared in late November 1931. He was reported missing by his parents on November 27th. He left home around 2 p.m. to drive to the store and never returned. The abandoned vehicle on Track 19 at the back of Morronglea was a good 11 hours drive from Coronga. It was about as far as you can drive on any given stretch from Coronga. It was past the watershed, past wastelands of tussock flats, past the salt pans. It was deep into the blazing moonscape of nothingness. There were routine searches, but the town rallied to his family, and his whereabouts became a widespread mystery. Detectives became involved, and misdeeds became a factor when, searching through Arthur's papers and accoutrements, evidence was uncovered of some attempts at forging cheques. There was no evidence he had ever cashed such a thing, yet detectives feared he may have lent his forging skills to a ring, or at least nefarious players. Detective Nolan described him as precocious many times in his notes. He was a precocious young man, vast, with a talent for deception and for forging signatures. It was a 30-year time lag. No sign of him was ever found. Sergeant Myers cast his mind to the Essex and its emptiness. The site would need to be searched again for any remains, and the next of kin would need to be informed. As for motive, precociousness might be enough. Some young men just decide not to come home from the store. The better explanation for the cheques and sheets of practice signatures was that the Norrises were, like everyone, facing hard times. Those were the years only shy of the Depression. It made vast Arthur meagre. He fell into the rocky desert. There was also inland madness. Myers had seen plenty of that over the years. The land can suck all sanity out of the soul. The featureless horizon grows appalling. He presumed that by precocious, Detective Nolan also meant inward, but Myers was suspicious of vast minds. In nature, intelligence makes a creature dangerous and unpredictable. It was a cold case in a hot desert. Myers, along with a Constable Haynes, marshalled another long drive, and later a charter plane swept the area around Track 19 again. The site was callous, stony, wind-smacked, sun-blasted, red, fierce. The grey Essex had ended just off the track, nose tilted into a gully. Myers, with Haynes, searched the car and the surrounds more thoroughly this time. There was no sign whatsoever of vast Arthur. If he drove the car as far as it could go, perhaps he continued walking until that happened to him. Perhaps he'd walked for another day. "I don't know," said Haynes. The scenario baffled him. He was younger than Myers. The gaping belly of red waste with orange wounds, its eroded immensity, was still intimidating. Track 19 continued on. The glove box in the Essex was locked shut. The seals were melted from the heat. Haynes fetched a screwdriver and with a good deal of effort pried it open. In the glove box, on a folded piece of notepaper, were the words, typed, "Covenant of Dread," all caps. Nothing else. Likewise, the rest of the car was empty, even on close inspection. There were, of course, no footprints. Maybe black trackers could find something, but that is doubtful after 30 years in the merciless cradle. "Seems obvious," says Haynes on the long drive back. "But why he drove out there, I don't know." After a while, he asked more questions. "Did he have any debts?" "Only the car," said Myers, "but he met the payments." "Girl trouble?" wondered Haynes. "Seems not." "A poof?" "Perhaps, but pure speculation. No evidence of it at all." "A history of abuse?" said Haynes, trying out every standard scenario he could imagine. "No evidence," said Myers again. "None." There was nothing sordid anywhere in the microfiche. Arthur Norris was known in Coronga as a precocious but good-natured egghead. A high IQ was the only sign of deviance. The Norrises were standard people, and Detective Nolan, in his rummaging, found no reason to doubt it. "The kid dabbled with forging some cheques," said Myers, putting it in perspective. "I don't think that's a reason." "Then what is?" asked Haynes. "I don't know. Does there have to be a reason?" "I don't think we'll ever know. In which case, there might as well not be a reason. It's just what he did. He left home and he kept driving. and he drove to the end. In the next few days, compiling their report, assembling a folio of photographs they had taken at the scene, Sergeant Myers looked up the words "Covenant of Dread." It was the only keepsake in the car. It was the only text from the scene. It was the only oddment to test. The only thing meaningful revealed by the search was a poem by Dennis Kalin. Had Arthur rehearsed verses on his track alone as he confronted his vastness? Was it thus his note farewell? Fittingly, the Covenant of Dread by Dennis Kalin is the song of a prophet who, at the dark peak of time, flees the decadent city for the wilderness, entering a covenant with the wretched earth. Sergeant Myers was not a man gifted in poetry, and it appeared to be fancy twaddle, but he understood the tenor of the lines. It's a long poem, and even then presents itself as an excerpt of something longer. Herein obviously was vast Arthur's inspiration. When Myers told Constable Haynes, he said to him, "Not debt, not girl trouble, not a poofter, not abuse, worse than that. Poetry." Vast Arthur was not the first young man to be led off into a romantic oblivion. When Haynes himself read over the poem, he was struck by just how apposite it was. Poetry was not his forte either, but he gave the poem a fresh eye. He was especially struck by the line, "The 19 licks that tracked the lizard tongue east." 19 tracks, he said. Track 19. Myers thought that interpretation was a lick too far, but overall in its imagery, the poem by Dennis Kalin was a perfect eulogy to Arthur's disappearance. Perfect. Haynes insisted, though, "The 19 licks that tracked the lizard tongue east." Maybe that's why Arthur drove up to track 19. Haynes imagined Arthur moving from the poem to a map, and on that basis deciding track 19 was his destination. There was no question, though, that the poem was relevant, and it was no accident that Arthur had left the words "Covenant of Dread" typed in all caps at the scene of his departure. Detective Nolan, in his notations preserved on microfiche, uncovered no evidence of any nefarious associations, and other than intimations of Swinburne made at 14, reported no proclivities to poetic malaise, unless that too was included in the word precocious. He used the words happy and content at points to underline that friends and family did not deem the young man troubled. But he was vast. He read books well beyond his year level. He was advanced in the cunning of chess. His hobby was astronomy. He gazed at gas clouds and galaxies. In the case of the case was a written reference from the town librarian, Mrs. Vincenza, who described him as an unusually bright fellow, who, she could attest, devoured books. She too notes his cooperative and unproblematic disposition. As far as policing was concerned, Sergeant Myers thought there was nothing more to say. But now with curiosity, he considered Dennis Kalin's poem again, and the puzzle of how mere words might mislead an unusually bright fellow to a dust-ridden doom. The case at the time had been especially shocking. Everyone in Coronga expected an illustrious future from vast Arthur, and it jolted their civic surety with a trauma. There was the question of why vast Arthur might do that to those good people. The Dennis Kalin poem was an obscure piece published in the magazine South Right in 1929 and then republished in the anthology Antipodean Voices in its many editions up until the war, but was not widely known or celebrated. Meyer could find no information at all about the poet, except a note that Covenant of Dread had been published posthumously. He could find no plain word commentary on the poem to help him get beyond the fancy twaddle. At this point, prompted by the written reference, he went to the Coronga Public Library. Mrs. Vincenza had long gone, of course, and the librarian instead was a wild-haired but engaging bookworm named Jenny Russell. Since the 1930s, the library had relocated into a whole new building. Sergeant Myers walked in in uniform, his standard issue pistol on his hip, asked to see the librarian and then said, "I'm trying to get sense out of this poem." Jenny Russell thought it funny, tickled by incongruity. The bookworm said she would assist if she could. Myers made no mention of the vast Arthur context. He was just trying to make sense of Dennis Kalin's poem for reasons unexplained. That is the habit of policemen. A week later, Jenny Russell had this information which she acquired from the original Southright publication. The poem, Covenant of Dread, had been published posthumously and submitted by Gerald Kalin, the brother, who reported that the poem was embedded in or attached to his brother's last will and testament. An editor's note said that Gerald Kalin's permission to have the poem published as commissioned in the poet's last will and testament was confirmed by the estate's lawyer, R.T. Hammond. There were no copyright problems. Southright published the work, which it regarded as a modern voice, in good faith. Jenny Russell advanced her opinion that the poem was a spiritual meditation upon the Australian emptiness. Its posthumous publication made it poignant. Meanwhile, Constable Haynes had made his own inquiries, but he landed in a different desert. "What do you know about Nietzsche?" he asked the sergeant. Myers said, "Who?" "Some German philosopher. He wrote a book called Zarathustra." Someone Haynes had consulted suggested the poem made such allusions. Myers suggested this onwards to Jenny Russell. "Ah," she said, "yes, that makes sense." "Does it?" "In the poem," she said, "the prophet walks fearlessly into the abyss. That's the Covenant of Dread. And in this way he shows himself to be the Superman. That's Nietzsche. That makes sense." The Superman? The Übermensch, the superior man who, unlike the herd, is unafraid of the meaninglessness of existence. From this, Myers heard enough to know it could addle a young man's mind. The poem attached to his will was Dennis Kalin's brave assertion as he faced the abyss of mortality. By extension, Arthur Norris had adopted it as his suicide note. When vast Arthur looked into the abyss looked back into him, and he drove pointlessly into the desert, death by philosophy. Paperwork concluded. Several months went by. The nearest Norris, an uncle, was notified in Melbourne, and he was sad but satisfied. An article ran in the Coronga Gazette announcing that the 30-year mystery had been more or less resolved. The car at least had been found, and the implications of what had become of Arthur of Great Promise were clear. He had not been kidnapped. He had not run off to Queensland. He had not been living a double life. He was not forging cheques for criminal gangs who did him in. There was no dire secret. But one day, on a compulsion, alone, off duty, Sergeant Myers made the trek out to Track 19 again. The Essex was slowly sinking into the red sand. The sergeant examined again the monstrous nothingness. Perhaps 1,000,000 years ago the land was living, but what was left was the shale beneath the sands, beneath the crusts of ancient oceans and mountains pulverised flat by the sun. It was Arthur's intention to move into the lost space. He wanted to be gone forever, without a trace. That is what the living cannot accept, without a trace. Myers went out early. He walked around for several hours. The wind came up and pushed him back. The distances were hostile. Only those who had made a covenant with the dread of nothing could ever walk beyond the edge of lost space. He didn't need to understand Arthur, though. The bleak steps of the Superman were not his curiosity. It was more the 19 licks that tracked the lizard tongue east, and whatever that might mean. After he went back from his third visit to the site, he consulted the microfiche files again, just to browse them with no question outstanding. The controversy surrounding the 14-year-old was interesting. In an exchange of letters, the English teacher, a stickler, thought that Arthur had made a fool of him, and that fabricating poems and presenting them as authentic was a misdemeanour. A district supervisor named Gibson, however, wrote noting the outstanding quality of the fabrications and asked whether the student might not be better encouraged in his rare talent rather than reprimanded. At length the poems were shown around to literary buffs for an assessment, and it was agreed they too might have been persuaded by them as readily as Arthur's teacher. Arthur was reprimanded in a letter from the headmaster, and it would seem that the boy agreed not to do such a prank again. It is here that Detective Nolan added notes that the teachers found Arthur precocious. It was as Myers was scrolling through the files, aimless, that a detail caught his eye, like a femur bone sticking up from the desert sands. In the practice runs of signatures, and on some attempts at forged cheques, Arthur had used the name R.T. Hammond. He practised several signatures and looked to be preparing a ruse. Detective Nolan had decorated these pages with unhelpful notes like none known and no information. But wasn't R.T. Hammond a name quoted by Jenny Russell of the Wild Hare? Detective Nolan had taken it to be fictitious. No. R.T. Hammond was the lawyer who blessed the publication of Dennis Kalin's Covenant of Dread via the brother Gerald, according to the copyright disclaimer in South Right. Myers looked him up. Records were 30 years distant. The Victorian Bar Register only showed a Roland Thomas Hammond, a criminal lawyer, but he died in 1924. There was no other R.T. Hammond practising law. Gently then, Myers peeled back the layers. Arthur had not been purloining a solicitor's signature. More likely, R.T. Hammond was his invention, a bogus name, just as Detective Nolan had surmised. Therefore, Southright had been subject to a hoax. Southright, of course, was long defunct. Its editors had passed on. In its short lifespan, it had dared to publish new poetic voices to a staid and bleary nation slapped artificially upon a strange and extraterrestrial bedrock. Myers had the full realisation. If he picked at the thread, the stitching came undone. Vast Arthur, he realised, was Dennis Kalin, and his brother, and his brother's lawyer. It was a necessary backstory to get the poem published. It was in the spring edition of Southright 1929, so at the time Arthur was barely 17 years old. Posing as Gerald, equipped with a letter from Hammond, he presented Covenant of Dread as a dead man's last word, and the editors of Southright were happy with its pedigree. But the poem was Vast Arthur's own meditation upon the metaphysical wasteland. It was, perhaps, fancy twaddle to a Philistine, but that only underlined that Myers was not himself Superman material. He was impressed by the boy's elaborate deception, but equally happy to put the poem in its proper provenance. Its wordcraft made more sense, and Constable Haynes was right. Track 19. There was probably such an allusion. But the motion was not from poem to map, but from map to poem. That is why the poem was so exactly apposite. Vast Arthur had already chosen the desolation of track 19 for his Zarathustrian fantasy. He was engineering a sense that makes no sense, but it only holds as long as he is never found. He published his suicide note a year before he even bought his Essex. He signed the covenant with fake signatures. Clever, thought the sergeant. But clever isn't profound.